In the last century before the birth of Christ, Egypt stood at the edge of two worlds. Once a mighty empire, it was now a fading jewel, its wealth coveted by Rome, its politics a web of intrigue and ambition. The line of Ptolemy had ruled for nearly 300 years, descendants not of Egyptian pharaohs, but of Macedonian conquerors who had taken the throne after Alexander the Great's death. From their palaces in Alexandria, the Ptolemies ruled as both Greek monarchs and Egyptian gods. They spoke Greek, worshipped Isis and Serapis, and kept their bloodline pure through the old royal custom of sibling marriage. But beneath the golden ceremony, Egypt's independence was slipping away. Rome had become its protector and its master. In this twilight of dynasties, a girl was born who would try to turn the tide. Her name was Cleopatra. Cleopatra VII. Philopator was born in 69 BCE, the daughter of Ptolemy III, or Let's, the flute player, a man more known for his music than his statecraft. Her mother's identity remains uncertain. Some believe she was Cleopatra Thusev, her father a sister and queen, others that she was a concubine of mixed Greek and Egyptian descent. Whatever her parentage, Cleopatra was born into a house divided by greed and fear. Her father's reign was precarious. Egypt was rich but bankrupt. The Nile's harvests filled the granaries of the world, yet much of that grain flowed north to feed Rome's people and Rome's ambitions. To secure his throne, Ptolemy XIII had paid bribes to the Roman Senate, vast sums that emptied his treasury and angered his people. When the money ran out, so did his friends in Rome. Cleopatra's childhood was a study in contrast, luxury and uncertainty side by side. She grew up in the palace at Alexandria, surrounded by tutors, scribes and priests. The great library and museum, though diminished, still housed scholars from across the Mediterranean. The young princess studied philosophy, mathematics, and the art of rhetoric. She learned to speak not only Greek, but Egyptian, Aramaic, Hebrew, and Latin. She was the first of her dynasty to speak the language of her subjects fluently. It was a sign of her nature pragmatic, intelligent, and deeply aware that power required understanding. Outside the palace, Alexandria was a city like no other. Built by Alexander the Great and ruled by his successors, it was the crossroads of the ancient world, a city of marble and bronze, of Greek temples and Egyptian shrines. Its harbour bustled with ships from every shore, its streets filled with philosophers, traders and soldiers. From the lighthouse of Pharos, one of the wonders of the world, the light shone far out across the Mediterranean, a symbol of knowledge, but also of empire. Cleopatra's father ruled poorly. His obsession with Rome and his dependence on foreign mercenaries made him deeply unpopular. In 58 BCE, revolt broke out in Alexandria. The people, weary of taxes and corruption, drove him from the throne. Ptolemy fled to Rome, leaving his daughters, including the young Cleopatra, behind. In his absence, Cleopatra's older sister, Berenice IV, seized power and ruled as queen. It was a turbulent time. Egypt's ancient gods and foreign masters seemed at war within the hearts of its people. For 3 years Berenice reigned, while their father begged Rome to restore him. In 55 BCE, with Roman gold and Roman swords, Ptolemy XIII returned. The rebellion was crushed. Berenice was executed. Cleopatra, barely 14, had seen her sister's rise and fall a lesson in both ambition and survival. Her father's restoration came at a heavy price. Egypt became a client kingdom of Rome, its throne dependent on Roman favour. When Ptolemy III died in 51 BCE, the crown passed to his 18-year-old daughter Cleopatra and her younger brother Ptolemy III, who was about 10. By custom, The two were to rule together as king and queen, husband and wife. But in truth, the court belonged to neither of them. Advisors, generals, and eunuchs schemed behind the scenes, each seeking to control the new monarchs. Cleopatra acted swiftly. She styled herself as the new Isis, the living goddess of Egypt, and issued decrees in her own name. She met ambassadors alone, a bold move for a woman in the ancient world. She understood that power could not be shared. It must be claimed. Her brother S. guardians, however, had other plans. Led by the powerful courtier Pothinus and the general Achilles, they sought to rule in the boy king's name. Tensions grew. In 49 BCE, open conflict erupted. Cleopatra was forced to flee Alexandria, raising her own army in the eastern desert. It was a dangerous time for rebellion. To the north, Rome itself was at war. Julius Caesar had crossed the Rubicon, defying the Senate and igniting civil conflict. The world's greatest empire was tearing itself apart, and Egypt was caught in the middle. In the summer of 48 BCE, the Roman war came to Alexandria. Pompey the Great, Caesar's rival and former ally, fled to Egypt after his defeat at Pharsalus. Hoping to win Caesar's favour, Ptolemy Thalcine's advisors had Pompey murdered as he stepped ashore. When Caesar arrived days later, they presented him with Pompeius' severed head. Caesar, horrified, turned away. Rome had killed one of its own, and Egypt's rulers had chosen poorly. Cleopatra saw her moment. She knew that if she could win Caesar's favour, she could reclaim her throne. But her brother's forces guarded the palace and city gates. The story of her arrival has been told 100 ways, wrapped in myth and legend. But the truth is simpler, and no less daring. One night, she was smuggled through the city's walls, hidden inside a roll of bedding. When the servants unrolled it before Caesar, the young queen stood before him unarmed, alone, but unflinching. She was 21 years old. Caesar, 52 and hardened by war, was not easily impressed. Yet Cleopatra possessed a rare presence. She was not the beauty later legend would make her, but her wit, intelligence and charm were disarming. She spoke to him as an equal, understanding the nature of power as well as he did. Their alliance was swift and deliberate. Cleopatra needed Caesar's protection to reclaim her throne. Caesar needed Egypt's grain and wealth to secure his own wars. Together they confronted Ptolemy Thetis' army in the Battle of the Nile. The fighting was fierce. The royal fleet burned in the harbour. The waters ran red with blood. In the end, Caesar's legions triumphed. Ptolemy the Elsen drowned in the Nile, trying to flee the battlefield. Cleopatra was restored to her throne now as co-ruler with her youngest brother, Ptolemy XIII, though the title meant little. She was queen in all but name. Caesar remained in Alexandria for several months. The two became lovers, and Cleopatra bore him a son, Caesarion, little Caesar. To the Egyptians he was divine, the child of Isis, and the god who ruled the world. To the Romans he was an inconvenient reminder of Caesar's human weakness. When Caesar departed for Rome, Cleopatra followed with her infant son, arriving in 46 BCE. Her presence in the capital was both scandal and spectacle. She lived in Caesar's villa across the Tiber, attended banquets, and was honoured publicly, though not as wife or citizen, for Roman law forbade it. Her enemies whispered that she had bewitched him. They called her a temptress, a sorceress, a queen who had made the conqueror of the world her slave. But Cleopatra understood the power of appearance. She did not hide her foreignness, she made it her weapon. Draped in gold and silk, she embodied Egypt itself, mysterious, wealthy, eternal. For a time it seemed the alliance between Rome and Egypt might endure. But on the Ides of March, 44 BCE, Julius Caesar was murdered by his own senators. When word reached Cleopatra, she was already sailing home to Egypt. She returned not as a queen secure in power, but as a widow of empire. Rome was again in chaos. Her protector was dead. In Alexandria, she named her son co-ruler as Ptolemy Thestisthene Caesarion, and began the work of consolidation. She executed her remaining brother, eliminating rivals, and strengthened Egypt's borders. She ruled with intelligence and caution, balancing between loyalty to Rome and the survival of her kingdom. But the world beyond her walls was changing faster than any monarch could command. Caesar's assassins were hunted down by his avengers, Mark Antony and Octavian, the man who would one day become Augustus. Egypt once again stood at the crossroads of history, and Cleopatra, last of the pharaohs, was not done shaping it. After the death of Julius Caesar, the world was divided not by nations but by men. Rome was no longer a republic in truth, but a battlefield where ambition and vengeance wrote its laws. The conspirators who had slain Caesar Brutus and Cassius fled east to raise armies. In the west, two new powers emerged: Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal lieutenant, and Gaius Octavian, Caesar's young adopted heir. Between them, the Mediterranean trembled. For Cleopatra, now in her mid-20s, survival meant navigating the storms of Roman politics without being consumed by them. Egypt was independent in name but vulnerable in fact. Its wealth, the grain of the Nile, the gold of Nubia, the ports of Alexandria made it indispensable and desirable. Whoever ruled Rome would eventually come for Egypt, either as friend or conqueror. She chose to make them her allies before they could become her masters. In 42 BCE, after Brutus and Cassius were defeated at Philippi, Antony became the master of the eastern provinces. Octavian ruled Rome and the west, while Antony held Greece, Asia, and the lands bordering Egypt. For Cleopatra, this was both danger and opportunity. Antony was a soldier, not a statesman. He was bold, charismatic, impulsive, a man of immense appetites and larger ambitions. Cleopatra knew his kind well. He needed money to pay his legions, and Egypt, rich and fertile, could provide it. The summons came in 41 BCE. Antony called the queen to meet him at Tarsus, in Cilicia, to account for her loyalty during the Roman Civil War. Many rulers trembled at such a command. Cleopatra prepared performance. She sailed up the Cydnus River not as a supplicant but as a goddess. Ancient historians describe her arrival with awe. Her shipped sails of purple silk, her oars of silver flashing in the sun, the scent of incense drifting over the water. She lay beneath a canopy of gold, dressed as Isis, while boys dressed as Cupids fanned her. The people of Tarsus crowded the river banks to see her. Antony, who prided himself on being larger than life, found himself outshone. Their first meeting was less seduction than negotiation. Cleopatra came armed with gifts, wit, and careful calculation. She flattered Antony's ego, played to his vanity, and promised him Egypt as wealth if he would respect her throne. What began as politics became passion. Antony followed her to Alexandria that winter, where the queen entertained him with lavish banquets, hunts, and feasts. They formed what was known as the Society of the Inimitable Livers, devoted to luxury, laughter, and excess. Yet beneath the revelry, Cleopatra was securing something far more lasting than pleasure and alliance. By spring she was pregnant with twins, a boy and a girl, whom she named Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene the sun and the moon. For a brief moment, the ancient world seemed to balance between two powers, Rome and Egypt, Antony and Cleopatra. But in Rome, Octavian watched with suspicion. To him, Antony's devotion to the Egyptian queen was treachery in all but name. Antony returned to Rome in 40 BCE to settle his uneasy partnership with Octavian. To cement their alliance, he married Octavia, Octavian's sister. Cleopatra was left in Alexandria, ruling her kingdom and raising her children. But she understood the ways of Roman politics. Marriage was strategy, not sentiment. She did not forget Antony, nor did he forget her. Over the next few years, the uneasy peace between Rome's rulers frayed. The Mediterranean was divided between East and West, and between them Cleopatra waited. Her loyalty was not to men, but to Egypt. She supplied Antony with funds and ships, ensuring that his fortunes remained tied to hers. In 37 BCE, Antony returned to the east. He met Cleopatra in Antioch, and their alliance was renewed stronger, more public and more political than ever. She bore him another son, Ptolemy Philadelphus, and together they envisioned a restoration of Alexander the Great's empire with Egypt at its heart. Antony's campaigns against Parthia, however, faltered. His army, ill-supplied and exhausted, suffered terrible losses in the eastern deserts. Cleopatra met him at the Syrian coast with food, money, and comfort. To his soldiers, she was no longer merely a queen, she was the embodiment of fortune itself, the power that sustained him when Rome could not. By 34 BCE, Antony and Cleopatra had become more than allies. They were partners in empire. In a grand ceremony at Alexandria known as the Donations, Antony distributed lands to their children, to Alexander Helios, Armenia and Media, to Cleopatra, Selene, Cyrenaica and Libya, to Ptolemy Philadelphus, Syria and Cilicia. Cleopatra herself was proclaimed Queen of Kings, ruler of Egypt and all the lands of the East. It was an act that stunned the ancient world. To the Egyptians, it was the rebirth of empire. To the Romans, it was heresy, an open challenge to Rome's supremacy. Octavian seized upon it. He painted Cleopatra as a foreign temptress who had ensnared Antony and sought to make herself queen over Rome. In speeches and propaganda, he spoke of the shame of Alexandria, a Roman general corrupted by the gold and perfumes of the East, kneeling before a barbarian queen. Antony's reputation in Rome withered. Senators who once followed him turned to Octavian. The alliance between the two men fractured beyond repair. Cleopatra knew what was coming. She strengthened her navy, amassed wealth, and fortified her ports. Her fleet at Alexandria was one of the largest in the Mediterranean, and her armies, trained and armed by Greek mercenaries, were disciplined and loyal. Yet she understood that Egypt alone could not withstand the might of Rome. Her fate and Antony's were now bound together. In 32 BCE, Octavian declared war not on Antony, but on Cleopatra herself. It was a masterstroke of politics. By naming the queen as the enemy, he turned Roman pride into a weapon. The Senate swore loyalty to him, the legions rallied, and the Mediterranean prepared for war. The decisive clash came the following year at Actium on the western coast of Greece. Antony and Cleopatra's combined fleet faced Octavian's under the command of Marcus Agrippa. It was September, the sea calm and bright. Cleopatra commanded her own squadron, her flagship adorned with gilded prows and Egyptian banners. For hours the two fleets circled and clashed, the air thick with smoke and arrows. Then, amid the chaos, Cleopatra's ships broke from the line and turned south. Historians have debated for centuries whether it was prearranged retreat, panic, or strategy. Seeing her sails depart, Antony followed with part of his fleet, abandoning the battle. The rest of his navy was destroyed. Actium was lost. For Rome, it was the end of the East's defiance. For Antony and Cleopatra, it was the beginning of the end. They fled back to Egypt, pursued by Octavian' forces. In Alexandria, the queen tried to rally her people, to rebuild her army, to prepare for siege. But morale was broken. Allies deserted. The gods themselves seemed silent. Cleopatra moved her treasure gold, jewels, spices, silks to her mausoleum, a magnificent structure she had built beside the palace. It was both a tomb and a fortress, stocked with provisions, guarded by loyal servants. If Egypt were to fall, she would not live to see it enslaved. By the summer of 30 BCE, Octavian's legions reached the city. Antony, desperate and exhausted, fought one last skirmish outside the walls. His cavalry defected, his fleet surrendered without a fight. Believing Cleopatra dead, Antony fell on his sword. When his servants found him bleeding, still alive, they carried him to the mausoleum where the queen had taken refuge. He died in her arms, his last words asking her to make peace with Octavian. Cleopatra, widow once more, sealed the doors of her tomb. Outside, Rome claimed victory. Inside, Egypt waited to die. 2050 words. Would you like me to continue directly with Part 3, The Fall of the Queen, covering Cleopatra's final negotiations with Octavian, her imprisonment and her death, the end of the Ptolemies and the birth of the Roman Empire? The summer sun of 30 BCE burned mercilessly over the Nile Delta. Alexandria, once the beacon of civilization, now lay quiet under the boots of Roman soldiers. The city that had been a jewel of marble and learning, where scholars once debated beneath the columns of the library, and merchants brought spices from India and gold from Nubia, had fallen into a tense and mournful silence. At the royal quarter by the sea, smoke rose where fires had raged through the night. The battle was over. The dynasty of the Ptolemies, which had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, was dying with its last queen. Cleopatra had withdrawn into her mausoleum, a palace within a tomb, guarded by a handful of loyal attendants. Her treasure had been moved there in the final days of the siege crates of gold coin, ivory, incense, and gems from distant lands. The walls were lined with tapestries depicting the gods. Isis with her wings outstretched, Osiris enthroned, Horus rising over the horizon like the morning sun. But Cleopatra herself was no longer the goddess queen of the Nile that poets once described. The long years of struggle had left their mark. The lines around her eyes were deeper. The weight of grief and exhaustion had dulled the gleam of youth. She wore no crown, only a simple linen robe and the cobra-shaped diadem of Egypt, the uraeus, upon her brow. Outside the sealed doors of the tomb, the city waited for her decision. Would she surrender? Would she take her own life, as Antony had? The news of Antonia's death had shaken her, though not surprised her. In her heart she had known there could be no peace between Rome and Egypt, not while she lived. Yet his death left her alone, surrounded by enemies. The man who had shared her throne, her bed, her ambitions, was gone. Octavian was approaching. When his troops entered Alexandria, he made his camp near the palace, issuing strict orders that the queen was not to be harmed. He knew her death could rob him of a triumph greater than any battle, the living capture of Cleopatra, the queen who had defied Rome. For 3 days, Cleopatra refused to leave her tomb. She sent word to Octavian through her steward, Proculus, pleading only that her children be spared. She would see him, she said, if he would promise them safety. Octavian agreed. His promises were calculated and cold. He wanted the queen alive. The first meeting took place within the mausoleum itself. When Octavian entered, the air inside was heavy with incense and the scent of lotus. Cleopatra stood before him, surrounded by her treasure, as though she meant to remind the conqueror what he had come for. She bowed, not deeply but deliberately, a gesture that was neither submission nor defiance. She spoke calmly, in Greek, the language of diplomacy. She reminded him of Rome's former alliance with Egypt, of her loyalty to Caesar, of her children who bore his name. She appealed to his reason, and perhaps to his vanity, hoping to find in Octavian some trace of mercy. But Octavian was not Caesar, nor Antony. He was 23 years old, ambitious, patient, and unyielding. To him, Cleopatra was a symbol, not a woman a prize to be displayed in Rome as proof of his supremacy. He listened without expression, his pale eyes studying her as one studies a relic. He assured her that no harm would come to her or her children. His tone was smooth, but Cleopatra knew the difference between courtesy and sincerity. When he left, she understood that his promises were made only to keep her alive until he could parade her in chains. That night, Cleopatra made her decision. She would not be humiliated. Over the next few days, she began to prepare for her death, as carefully as she had once prepared for a coronation. She visited the shrine of Isis within the palace, offering prayers and libations. She ordered her servants to bring food, wine, and clothing into the tomb, telling them she wished to rest there. To the Romans watching her, it seemed as though the queen had resigned herself to captivity. But those closest to her, her attendants Charmian and Iris, knew the truth. They were sworn to die beside her. Octavian, suspecting her intent, sent messengers daily to ensure she was alive. He even placed guards at the door of the tomb. Cleopatra responded with calm indifference. She entertained the guards with polite words, even gifts, so that their vigilance softened. Then, on a hot August afternoon, she asked that a peasant be allowed to bring her a basket of figs. The guards, seeing only fruit, let it pass. Inside the basket, hidden beneath the leaves, was the small and deadly creature that would end her reign, the asp, sacred to Egypt, symbol of royalty and rebirth. Cleopatra bathed and dressed in her royal robes. She adorned herself with jewels as if for a final audience. Her servants laid a golden couch within the tomb, and there she reclined, her diadem shining faintly in the half-light. To her attendants, she spoke quietly of her children. She asked that they not mourn her as one defeated, but as a queen who met her end on her own terms. She had lived as the daughter of Isis, she said, and would die as the goddess returned to her divine mother. Then she took the asp in her hand. The serpent, coiled and silent, struck once upon her arm. Charmian and Iris, faithful beyond all measure, followed her example. When Octavian's soldiers forced the doors open soon after, they found the queen lying on her couch, her face serene, her body already growing cold. The diadem still rested upon her brow, the faint mark of the asp's bite upon her arm. Charmian, half alive, was arranging the crown upon her mistress's head. When a soldier demanded if this was her doing, she is said to have replied, "It is well done, as befitting one descended from so many kings." Cleopatra was 39 years old. Her death marked the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty and the fall of Egypt as an independent kingdom. Octavian ordered her body buried beside Antony, fulfilling her last request. Their tomb was sealed, its location lost to time. In Rome, Octavian celebrated his triumph. The treasures of Egypt's statues, gold, tapestries, even the obelisks that had stood by the Nile for centuries were carried through the streets. Behind them walked prisoners, among them Cleopatra's eldest children. The queen herself was absent, her death robbing the spectacle of its final humiliation. Octavian returned to power as Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. The Republic was dead. The empire had begun. For Egypt the change was profound. The land of the pharaohs became a province of Rome, its temples supervised, its grain fields taxed, its priests made servants of a foreign emperor. The language of administration turned Latin, the faces on its coins Roman. Yet in the villages along the Nile, people still spoke of the queen who had died with the serpentess kiss. Her image endured in legend long after her throne had vanished. To some she was the seductress who brought ruin to great men, to others the last true pharaoh who chose death rather than surrender. In Alexandria, old sailors swore they could still see her barge upon the sea at sunset, sails of purple catching the wind as if eternity itself bore her away. The Romans, for all their conquest, could never fully erase her. Statues of her likeness stood in temples for centuries, and the cult of Isis spread across the empire from Britain to Hispania, carrying echoes of her name. In time, poets and historians transformed her into myth, the queen who ruled through beauty and intelligence, who loved not foolishly but fiercely, and whose death marked the twilight of two civilizations, the ancient world of the Nile and the fading republic of Rome. Even in death, Cleopatra achieved what she could not in life: immortality of memory. Her story would be told in marble, in papyrus, in poetry and plays. Scholars would debate her motives, artists would paint her image, rulers would envy her legend. Yet beneath all the retellings, one truth remained unchanged. Cleopatra VII, daughter of the Nile, was the last sovereign of an unbroken line stretching back to the dawn of recorded time. When the Assi struck, it did more than end a life. It closed the final chapter of Egypt's ancient glory. And as the centuries passed, the sands of the desert crept over her kingdom, burying temples and tombs alike. But her name endured, whispered like a spell through history, a name that outlasted empires: Cleopatra, the last queen of Egypt. In the days following Cleopatra's death, Alexandria fell silent. The once proud city, heart of learning and commerce, seemed to pause in reverence or disbelief. Her body, preserved and prepared in the ancient Egyptian fashion, was laid beside Antony S in the royal mausoleum. No grand funeral procession was permitted. Rome would not allow Egypt's last sovereign to be mourned as a goddess, but within the temple precincts, priests and commoners whispered prayers to Isis, believing the departed queen now journeyed among the stars. The reign of the Ptolemies had ended, and Egypt awoke to a new reality. Octavian stood as master not only of the Nile but of the entire Mediterranean world. With Cleopatra's death, the curtain fell on 3 centuries of Greek rule, and in its place rose the first province of Rome's new empire. The fate of the children. Cleopatra's surviving children. Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus were taken to Rome under Octavian's control. The eldest, Caesarion, the son of Julius Caesar, had been sent by his mother southward toward Ethiopia in a desperate bid to escape the conqueror. But he was betrayed on the road. Octavian's agents captured him, and at the empress' order he was quietly executed. He was 17 years old. With his death, the line of the pharaohs truly ended. The younger children were spared. Octavian had no reason to kill them. They were too young to threaten him, and too useful as living trophies of his victory. In Rome, they were paraded through the streets during his triumph. The people stared at them foreign, jewelled, bewildered, as the spoils of empire marched behind. Afterward they were entrusted to Octavia, Octavian's sister, and the abandoned wife of Antony. She raised them in her household, treating them with kindness and restraint. For the daughter, Cleopatra Selene, Octavia arranged a future. In time, she was married to Juba II, the scholarly king of Mauritania, a North African realm loyal to Rome. Through that union, the bloodline of the Ptolemies and the Caesars continued quietly far from the Nile. Cleopatra Selene became queen of a distant land, and though she ruled under Rome's shadow, her coins still bore symbols of Egypt: the crescent moon, the lotus, and the crocodile of the Nile. In those small emblems the spirit of her mother lived on. As for her brothers, history records little. Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus vanish from the chronicles within a few years of their arrival in Rome. Perhaps they died young, or perhaps they were absorbed into the quiet anonymity of noble Roman households. The empire did not care to remember them. Egypt under Rome. With Cleopatra's death, Octavian moved swiftly to secure Egypt. He declared it the personal property of the emperor, not a senatorial province. No senator was allowed to enter without permission. Egypt was now the emperor's private domain, the key to Rome's food supply and the jewel of its treasury. The new governor, Cornelius Gallus, established order with ruthless efficiency. Temples were restored where it served Roman prestige, and taxes were restructured to ensure the steady flow of grain up the Nile and across the sea. In Alexandria, life adapted with the pragmatism of survival. The Greek elite who had once served the Ptolemies swore loyalty to Rome, and merchants resumed their trade under new masters. Scholars continued their studies in what remained of the library's collection, now a shadow of its former glory. The priests of Isis and Osiris learned to pray for both the emperor and the old gods in the same breath. Yet for all the outward submission, Cleopatra's memory lingered in the hearts of her people. In the villages, mothers still told their daughters tales of the queen who would not bow to the west. Fishermen on the Nile swore that on certain nights, when the moon rose red above the water, one could see her reflection, her face calm, her crown glinting, her eyes fixed on eternity. To the Romans, however, Cleopatra's story was rewritten. In Octavian's official histories, she was portrayed as a manipulator, a dangerous temptress who had led Antony astray and nearly destroyed Rome's virtue. She became the embodiment of Eastern decadence, a moral lesson for the empire. Plays and poems mocked her ambition, her luxury, her foreign ways. But history has a way of turning propaganda into myth. The making of a legend. In the century that followed, Cleopatra's image evolved. As the Roman world expanded, fascination replaced fear. Artists began to depict her not as a villain, but as a tragic queen, undone by fate and love. In marble and mosaic she appeared reclining upon her golden couch, the asp coiled at her arm, her face serene in death. Writers of the early empire, Plutarch, Dio Cassius, and later Appian, recorded her story with a mixture of awe and condescension. They could not ignore her intellect, her command of languages, her political brilliance. She spoke Greek, Egyptian, Hebrew, and Aramaic. She governed a kingdom in turmoil and held her own against the most powerful men of her age. Even her enemies, writing generations later, admitted her presence was extraordinary. In one account, Plutarch described her not as the most beautiful of women, but as one whose charm was irresistible, whose voice and wit made her company unforgettable. She was, he wrote, a woman who knew how to subdue even a god. As the centuries passed, Cleopatra's memory took on new shapes. In Byzantine tales, she became the sorceress of Egypt. In Arab chronicles, a philosopher queen who built temples and studied the stars. During the Renaissance, when Europe rediscovered the classical past, her legend was reborn again. Painters rendered her as the epitome of tragic beauty, Her death transformed into an act of theatrical grace. Shakespeare, writing in the early 17th century, gave her words that the real queen never spoke but might have wished to. "Give me my robe, put on my crown. I have immortal longings in me." The world remembered her not as a ruler among men, but as an idea, a symbol of love, power, and defiance. The echoes of empire. Yet beneath the myth, the truth of her life remained political. Cleopatra's reign was not a love story, but a struggle for sovereignty. She inherited a weakened kingdom surrounded by foreign powers and preserved it through intelligence, diplomacy, and will. For 2 decades she kept Egypt independent, balancing alliances and wars, mastering the language of both her people and her conquerors. The monument she built still bore her cartouche, the oval that enclosed the names of pharaohs. On the walls of Dendera and Philae she is carved alongside her son Caesarion, offering gifts to the gods. Even after Rome ruled her land, her image remained upon its temples, untouched. To erase her name would have been to defy the gods themselves. The Nile carried her memory downstream for generations. In Thebes, priests recited hymns to Isis that invoked the Lady of the Two Lands, which once meant the queen herself. Travellers spoke of her as a spirit who guarded Egypt's borders, her eyes turned eternally toward the desert horizon. In Rome, her legacy took another form. Octavian, now Augustus, learned from her example. He adopted her tools of divine kingship, the blending of religion and rule, the use of imagery and ritual to sanctify power. In a strange twist of fate, the very queen Rome had sought to destroy helped shape the foundation of its empire. Her story became a mirror in which every age saw its own reflection. To the Romans, a warning; to the Renaissance, an ideal; to the modern world, a riddle of power, gender, and destiny. The lost tomb. For 2 millennia, scholars have sought the resting place of Antony and Cleopatra. Ancient writers spoke of a tomb near the temple of Isis, perhaps overlooking the sea. Earthquakes and floods later swallowed much of the old city's shoreline, leaving monuments buried beneath sand and water. In the 21st century, archaeologists began to explore beneath Taposiris Magna, west of Alexandria, believing it might conceal the royal mausoleum. There, amid tunnels and statues, they uncovered coins bearing her likeness and inscriptions dedicated to Isis. Whether her body truly lies beneath those stones remains uncertain, but perhaps it does not matter. Cleopatra's tomb, like her life, was meant to vanish into legend. What endures is not the body but the myth, the image of a queen who defied the world and chose her own fate. In the quiet galleries of museums, her face still looks out from coins struck 20 centuries ago, her profile strong, her gaze forward, her features neither Greek nor Egyptian, but something between, as if belonging to both worlds and neither. Each line etched in silver and gold is a whisper from that vanished age, the last breath of a civilization that had once ruled the known world. And so the story of Cleopatra does not end in her tomb, or in Rome's triumph, but in the endurance of her name passed from empire to empire, from tongue to tongue, from history to legend. Centuries passed, and the sands of Egypt continued their slow, patient work burying temples, swallowing cities, erasing the marks of empire. The Nile rose and fell as it always had, indifferent to the rise of Caesars or the fall of kingdoms. Yet through every age one name survived the drift of history: Cleopatra. Her kingdom was gone, her bloodline extinguished, her tomb lost. But her legend lived, reshaped and reborn in each generation, her image risen like the Nile flood eternal, unpredictable, irresistible. The Roman memory. In the world that followed her death, Rome sought to control her legacy as it had controlled her land. Augustus, careful master of propaganda, understood that the story of Cleopatra was dangerous. It spoke of power beyond Rome, of a woman who had challenged the empire itself. So, the tale was rewritten. In the official histories, Cleopatra became the seductress, the foreign queen whose charms had corrupted noble men, first Julius Caesar, then Mark Antony. Roman poets, eager to flatter their emperor, painted her as the embodiment of Eastern excess and moral decay. Virgil, in the Aeneid, cast her as a witch queen at Actium, her monstrous gods arrayed against the virtuous Romans. Horace and Propertius echoed the same refrain. She was not a ruler but a ruin, a warning to all who defied Rome's destiny. It was a political fiction, but a powerful one. The men who wrote those verses did not know her, yet they ensured that for centuries she would be remembered not for her intellect or leadership, but for her beauty and her fall. Still, the Roman image could not completely erase her strength. Even as they condemned her, the poets could not resist her. There was something magnetic in her defiance, something unsettling in her ability to choose death rather than humiliation. Augustus had defeated her body, but not her legend. The Middle Ages, the scholar as queen. After Rome's empire faded, the world turned its gaze elsewhere. For centuries, Cleopatra's story lay half forgotten in crumbling scrolls and fading Latin texts. Yet even in obscurity, her name survived. In the Arab world, she re-emerged as Cleopatra the Wise. Scholars of the medieval Islamic age, inheriting the sciences of Greece and Egypt, saw her not as a temptress, but as a philosopher queen. She was credited with writings on alchemy, astronomy, and medicine. In these accounts, she was a seeker of knowledge, a builder of temples, a student of the mysteries of life and death. This transformation reflected a deeper truth. Cleopatra had been educated in the arts of philosophy and science. The real queen had spoken with scholars in Alexandria, studied the stars, and ruled with an understanding that knowledge itself was a form of power. The Arab chroniclers, unlike the Romans, saw her intellect before her allure. To them, she was not a sinner, but a sage. The Renaissance, the rebirth of the Queen. When Europe rediscovered the ancient world, Cleopatra returned to its imagination. Renaissance artists and writers, reading the old accounts of Plutarch and Cassius Dio, found in her story a mirror for their own age, a tale of passion and empire, of love entangled with power. Painters in Venice and Florence filled their canvases with her final moments, the queen in silks of gold, reclining as the asp strikes her breast. Her death became the perfect tableau of beauty and tragedy, an image of mortal grace. But in the salons and studies of humanist Europe, she was also admired for her intellect. Scholars marvelled at her mastery of languages and her political cunning. The contradictions of her life fascinated them. She was both a seductress and a scholar, both the downfall of men and the saviour of her people. In the England of William Shakespeare, her story reached new heights. In Antony and Cleopatra, the playwright gave her voice a poetry that defied death itself. She was no longer the villain of Rome's propaganda, but a living, breathing woman complex, proud, vulnerable, and magnificent. When she cried, "I am fire and air. My other elements I give to baser life," Shakespeare captured not only a queen but an eternal human truth, the will to shape one's fate, even at the edge of ruin. His Cleopatra was the first modern one, a woman defined not by beauty or scandal, but by self-awareness. The Age of Empires, the colonial fantasy. In the 19th century, As European empires expanded into Africa, Cleopatra's story was seized again, this time by the West's fascination with the Orient. Painters of the Romantic Age imagined her as the ultimate exotic figure, dark-eyed, draped in jewels, reclining in perfumed splendor. The image was alluring but hollow. It turned the queen into a fantasy of male imagination, stripping her of her politics and her intellect. The Cleopatra of these canvases was no longer a strategist, but a symbol, an emblem of luxury, decadence, and doomed passion. Yet even this distortion could not erase her power. Writers such as George Bernard Shaw and Théophile Gautier began to revisit her life with new sympathy. They saw in her story the conflict between East and West, between individual will and imperial force. And in the growing age of women's emancipation, some began to read her differently. Cleopatra became a figure of defiance against patriarchal control, a ruler who lived and died by her own command, not as the pawn of men, but as their equal, and at times their superior. The modern age. The icon reborn. The 20th century brought her into the light once more, this time on screens of silver and gold. In 1934, Claudette Colbert portrayed her as a goddess of wit and seduction. In 1963, Elizabeth Taylor transformed her into a figure of modern royalty, flawed, powerful, and human. That film, vast and extravagant, became one of the most ambitious in cinematic history. Its production mirrored the legend it sought to tell, a story of beauty, power, and ruin on a colossal scale. But beyond Hollywood's glamour, scholars began to rediscover the real Cleopatra. Archaeologists traced her coins and inscriptions. Historians studied her reign not as a footnote to Rome, but as a chapter in Egypt's long continuum. They found evidence of her reforms, her diplomacy, her careful navigation of cultures. The woman who emerged from those studies was neither saint nor siren, but a sovereign, intelligent, pragmatic, multilingual, and fiercely loyal to her country. She was the last defender of an ancient civilization caught between worlds, the Hellenistic and the Roman, the divine and the mortal. Her face, preserved on coins minted in her lifetime, defied the fantasy. It was not the face of a Hollywood star, but of a queen. Strong jaw, aquiline nose, intelligent eyes. It was the face of someone who ruled, not merely someone who was desired. Cleopatra and the feminine ideal. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, Cleopatra became a symbol once more, this time for autonomy and self-definition. Feminist scholars reclaimed her as a woman who refused to be written by others. In her lifetime, she had mastered the languages of power. She could speak to her subjects in Egyptian, negotiate in Greek, charm in Latin. She governed through intellect and presence, not just beauty. In a world ruled by men, she held her own through the sheer force of will. Her death, long interpreted as a lover's suicide, came to be seen as an act of control, the final assertion of sovereignty over her body and her story. If Rome would not allow her to live as a queen, she would not allow them to parade her as a captive. To modernize, this defiance resonates. Cleopatra stands as a symbol not of excess, but of agency, the right to define one's fate even in the face of empire. The eternal return. More than 2,000 years have passed since she died in her marble tomb beside the sea. Egypt has changed hands 100 times. The Library of Alexandria is dust. The pharaoh's temples lie half buried beneath the desert wind. And yet, the world still speaks her name. Artists still paint her. Writers still debate her. Filmmakers still seek to capture her spirit. Every generation returns to her story because it holds within it every contradiction of humanity. love and ambition, intellect and passion, triumph and loss. She is the dreamer and the realist, the goddess and the woman, the ruler and the rebel. To study Cleopatra is to study the mirror of civilization itself, the struggle between East and West, between gender and power, between myth and memory. Perhaps this is why her tomb has never been found. Perhaps it was never meant to be. For Cleopatra's truest monument is not of stone or gold, but of story. She lives wherever her name is spoken, wherever her legend stirs the imagination. And in that sense she achieved what she always sought: immortality. Epilogue. When the last light of day fades over the Mediterranean and the stars begin to rise, one can imagine her barge again, its purple, sails unfurled, gliding silently across the dark water. The air smells faintly of lotus and cedar. The torches burn gold against the night. At the prow stands a figure, crowned and calm, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Behind her, the wake glitters like the Milky Way fading into the sea. The queen has passed into legend, but legend, like the Nile, never dies. Cleopatra VII, Cleopatra, daughter of Isis, last pharaoh of Egypt, eternal queen of the Nile. Her story is not merely of the past. It is the story of how power, beauty, and intellect endure long after the empires that sought to contain them have turned to dust.